From struggling to live up to the legacy of Game of Thrones, to the lack of consequences that make each character's decisions seem irrelevant. Here's why House of the Dragon is worse than Game of Thrones. To be fair, it was always going to have a tough time finding its footing, because it's following up one of the greatest shows of all time. It's easy to take Game of Thrones' legacy for granted nowadays, but when it was first released, it was an eye-opening experience for most viewers. We just never seen epic fantasy done on such a huge scale. At least not on TV, of course. Sure, Lord of the Rings proved that high fantasy stories could be adapted for the big screen, but see, Game of Thrones was a TV show, so no one expected it to be that good. The lead-up to the first season of House of the Dragon was a stressful time for most fans, mostly because of how Game of Thrones ended. The disappointing final season was arguably the worst series finale in TV history. And House of the Dragon basically just seemed like damage control at this point. You see, HBO knew it had struck gold with Game of Thrones, and a lot of fans felt like House of the Dragon was just a shameless cash grab. You have to admit that these concerns are warranted. There are certainly a lot of stories to tell in the world of Westeros, but studios are notorious for trying to milk franchises for everything they've got. Just take a look at what happened with The Lord of the Rings. The original films comprised a pitch-perfect trilogy, yet Warner Bros. Still wasn't satisfied. They decided to turn The Hobbit into yet another trilogy, even though the original book is barely a third as long as The Lord of the Rings. House of the Dragon definitely looks like another blatant attempt to cash in, especially given the source material, because Game of Thrones is based on a proper fantasy novel series. But that's not the case for House of the Dragon. You see, this new show isn't based on any George R.R. Martin novels. Rather, it draws its storyline from the fictional historical text called Blood and Fire. It depicts the rise and fall of the Targaryen dynasty, but instead of using a straightforward narrative, reads like an academic text that's actually by design. Because Fire and Blood is a companion text to A Song of Ice and Fire, it was never meant to be seen as a standalone book, so turning it into a fully fledged series was a stretch, to say the least. I guess you could say that these events are laid out in Fire and Blood, but that still doesn't explain where this whole narrative is coming from. The whole reason behind Game of Thrones' success was Martin's masterful storytelling. And while House of the Dragon certainly stays faithful to Fire and Blood, we've all seen how badly things turn out when the writers flesh out random events without George's guiding hand. I don't think anyone's going to forget how badly D.B. Weiss and David Benioff handled things, right? I mean, sure, Martin had told them what would happen in the final 2 books of his series. But even so, as soon as they ran out of the story and had to think for themselves, things went sideways fast. To be fair, House of the Dragon is way better than Game of Thrones' final season, but that's not saying much. The first season's plotting storyline left a lot to be desired. For one thing, House of the Dragon isn't about good versus evil. There are no White Walkers to fend off, nor are there straightforward villains like Joffrey and Cersei. Don't get me wrong, complex characters are integral to Game of Thrones, but the lack of an overarching good and evil storyline makes it hard to care about what's happening. Sure, Rhaenyra is a solid character, and her rivalry with Alicent is pretty compelling. The political intrigue also reminds me a lot of Game of Thrones, with Daemon's antics being strikingly similar to those of Littlefinger. But that's just not enough. The shadowy machinations of the court of King's Landing were just one aspect of Game of Thrones. You also had plenty of other storylines to mix things up, including Daenerys' odyssey across Essos and Jon's struggles to live up to his father. House of the Dragon isn't depicting real-life political turmoil. So what are the stakes here exactly? Fans already know what's going to happen a couple hundred years later, so there's just not much to make people care about the characters on this show. Honestly, I feel like House of the Dragon could have been way better, if not for one thing: those frustrating time jumps. Look, I get it. The show is trying to tell a decades-long tale in the span of a single season. But couldn't they have done that without the jarring shift from Millie Alcock to Emma Darcy? Sure, the change-up was announced well before the season came out, but most viewers were already invested in Alcock's interpretation of the character. And the writers didn't do a great job of explaining what was going on. I mean, the vague time jumps just made the plot difficult to follow. And it robbed House of the Dragon of the smooth storytelling that set Game of Thrones apart. If the writers wanted to switch actors halfway through, they needed to make the change feel seamless. Instead, it didn't just feel like we were seeing a new actress, it felt like we were watching a different character entirely. There was just too big of a gap between Alcock and Darcy's performances. Which is a real shame because Rhaenyra is one of the few good characters on the show. What's more, some characters seem drastically different after a time jump, like Rhaenyra. But others, like Daemon, barely change, both in terms of appearance and characterization. The time jumps could have worked if only they'd been interwoven into each episode. That would have given fans the chance to get used to each version of the character. But for some strange reason, the writers decided to go for the chronological approach. It's not even like the story tried to do anything different either. At least on the surface, the first seasons of both shows are quite similar. Just think about it for a second. The death of a king in both storylines causes a succession crisis, and worsened by the questionable parentage of the chosen heir. Joffrey was never a true Baratheon, which was pretty obvious because of his hair. Sound familiar? Yep, that's exactly why people think Rhaenyra's kids are illegitimate too. Not only does House of the Dragon draw a lot of its plot from the first season of Game of Thrones, but it fails to measure up to its predecessor in every way. After all, the succession storyline was only a small part of Game of Thrones' first season. And despite House of the Dragon covering a fraction of the plot of its predecessor, it still somehow managed to mess up the pacing. Fans are in fact perplexed by how small House of the Dragon seems in comparison to Game of Thrones. We barely make it out of King's Landing, save for a few brief forays into Dragonstone, whereas in Game of Thrones, we venture from Dorne all the way to the Wall and beyond. To top it all off, the eponymous dragons that are supposed to be at the heart of the show are seriously underwhelming. They seem to just be there in the background, with scarcely any battle scenes in the entire season. To be fair, it'd be difficult to give the dragons too much screen time, even with a $20 million budget. But even so, the show squanders the opportunity to do them justice. I guess we get a few scenes with certain characters learning how to ride the dragons. And I'll admit it was pretty awesome seeing Vhagar's massive shadow fly over Araxes and Lucerys. But there really wasn't much more to the dragons than that. A couple of aerial battles spice things up every now and again. Yet the dragons lack the same emotional depth as Daenerys' little fire breathers. Treating these epic creatures like furniture does them a huge disservice. And it was just one of the many things that this show didn't do nearly as well as Game of Thrones. I guess that final sequence where Aemon kills Luce sets up an exciting storyline for Season 2, which is thanks in no small part to Vhagar. But something tells me that the aftermath won't be very severe. After all, barely any actions on this show seem to have any consequences. Like, remember when Joffrey took Ned Stark's head? The ripple effects of that decision played out for 3 whole seasons at least. Unfortunately, the House of the Dragon seems to have missed the memo. Daemon and Viserys' storyline is a great example of that, because the two brothers will be at each other's throats in one episode, only to forget about it in the next one. We don't even get an explanation for their behavior toward each other. I guess the showrunners were hoping the dragons would distract us. Even major events like the conflict with the Triarchy don't have much of an impact on the main plot. The whole invasion starts and ends so quickly that it barely registers, which is just a strange way to handle a storyline with such potential. So from the odd lack of cause and effect to any of the characters' actions, to the undoubtedly challenging task of living up to the GOAT TV show that preceded it, this is why House of the Dragon is worse than Game of Thrones. Ooh.